So Matthew Buckley Smith has me over at his house and is getting me prepared for the podcast. We're in our underwear.
Oh, God, it's this kind of tricky.
But he insists on walking around the woods surrounding his house in our underwear. He's giddy and jumping from topic to topic. He's full of energy. He starts to show me many different martial arts stances. In the dream, he's taller than me, and I don't think I can be as good a martial artist as he is. There are many seasons represented in the woods. We get back, and Joanna and her friends start to show up, and I'm embarrassed to be in my underwear. Matthew starts to make everyone an elaborate margarita. That's it.
Yeah, there's some elements that seem, there's some true to life. Yeah, thank you. I fear that some version of that will end up on a SLEERICKETS t-shirt at some point, but we'll see. We'll see what the market demands.
Sure. I'd be happy to illustrate that pro bono.
I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. Thank you, as always, to all of you for listening, and to everyone who has left a rating, a review, or just subscribed to the show. It really means a lot. If you've not yet had a chance to do that, please go to Apple Podcasts or whatever your podcast distributor might be. Leave a rating, leave a review, subscribe to the show, or if you have a chance sometime this week, recommend it to somebody you think might like it. I do appreciate it. But now I'm going to get to today's main event, which is a really thoroughly delightful conversation I had with Steve Teare, a Philadelphia-based artist, illustrator, comics artist. He does a lot of his work is writing comic books, but also comic strips. He is published in The New Yorker, in Vice, in The Believer, and very frequently in The Nib, and in any number of other publications. I have included in the show notes a slew of links to his work, and you can also keep up with his latest art on his Instagram feed, which is at Steve Teare, STEVETEARE. On today's show, though, he joined me as a lifelong comics fan, a lifelong lover of mainstream and indie comics alike, to present, I think, a pretty persuasive argument against taking superheroes seriously. Here is my really fun conversation with Steve Teare. You do comics and you do drawings and art of your own, but you also, like, a very large part of your work seems to be illustration, which has its own, like, musical accompaniment. It sort of has you have to have a philosophy to do it, like, of what it's supposed to be, because it's a little bit of an open-ended question.
Yeah, it's true. Most of it's hard to even know what work I do is for myself, because there seems to be, I've been able to find work that has almost like gradations of my own input, So it's kind of like the whole artist thing. Like, I remember when I was in school, artists talking about, like, being able to find work where they're working on commission, and then also just finding an audience so they could make their own fine art. And I feel like I found an odd thing where I do all kinds of combinations of those things, and I rarely actually do my own pure artwork just by my own. I'm working on a comic now that I wrote, and I don't. It's perhaps the most pure art for me, because I don't know that it'll ever see any light of day. I don't know if it will. I don't know whose hands it's going to get into. Whereas, like, the comics that I do for hire, I'm usually writing them, and I'm usually also drawing them, and the idea is usually mine. So it's theoretically it's part of my own interest and artwork, but it has a lot of editors' hands in it, and it has kind of like the aesthetic of the magazine or the website where it's supposed to be, and that's kind of drawing it farther away from me. And it becomes its own challenge to get it to the final stage where it can finally be seen by other people. And I don't it doesn't, that process doesn't bother me, but it is a little bit removed from my own desires, I guess you could say.
There is a lot of the most celebrated art that we have throughout history was commissioned. So I don't know. I'm not sure if like we may overvalue independent, no strings attached artistic vision in some ways. Like I think that it may be that having a little bit of either restriction or having a platform formally or publicly or whatever is maybe part of the bargain to making art.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're obsessed with ownership, and I feel like it's related to what we've been talking about in terms of these comics characters in the movies and the TV shows and the things that happen after them, because no one really owns any of these things. We're all just sort of involved in it.
So I knew I wanted to do an episode with you a little while ago, but I wasn't sure exactly what about. So you had what to me, at least at the moment, was an unlikely suggestion that we've then talked a fair amount about, which was initially the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And
right.
we talked about that, and then we've also talked some about Batman and a few different incarnations. And so we have I know at least however small the audience might be, it has a pretty big range of ages. So would you just give a brief overview of what the fuck we're talking about? Like what is from scratch, what are the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles?
Well, I might not have to describe Batman. However, the Ninja Turtles were first an independent and an independently printed comic series by a couple guys in, I think it was New Hampshire, a guy named Peter Laird and his partner Kevin Eastman, and they both illustrated and both wrote this very kind of almost like a comics farce. It was like a love letter to a lot of gritty comics that had come before this. We're talking about the mid 1980s here, early 1980s, and it was sort of a love letter to comics or TV shows like Conan the Barbarian and Frank Miller's Ronin and the New Mutants and the Marvel mutant varieties of characters, and maybe a few others. And they somehow they did a few of these issues, I think maybe 10 issues. It was supposed to be a short-lived series. They were financing it themselves. I don't know how many they were selling initially. And my understanding is I haven't read the earliest issues, but I think that they're a little violent, and they're also kind of ridiculous. The comic itself knows that it's ridiculous. These sort of turtles that are supposed to be fast, mutant, and have enemies within the city that somehow know who the turtles are and want to kill them, and they have a sensei or a master that is a rat, and for the audience members, that rat is named Splinter. But anyway, shortly after the series got going, they met toy producers. It was a small toy company at the time, and they wanted to have a character that looked like maybe something like a Ninja Turtle, and they tried it out, see if they could produce these toys, and they were a success. The toy company also started to partner with cartoon producers, and a more kind of kid-friendly cartoon spawned out of that. And most people who are around my age, I'm 35, probably know the Ninja Turtles through those action figures and the Saturday morning cartoon, which ran from the mid 80s, very shortly after this comic book was produced, until I think the mid 90s. And the first Ninja Turtles movie came out in 1989. So I hope that's
same year as the Tim Burton Batman came out. So you showed me a series of images, and we're going to try to find a way to make this available. We'll have some kind of link on the show notes for some images that you can see of these various incarnations of the characters. But part of what struck me about it is that it's almost impossible to make it dignified because it's such a silly concept to begin with, and then it is almost immediately turned into toys and cartoons, and so it's almost like there's no like deep content to it. It's just a vehicle for style, for one or another way of drawing and showing action and stories.
Right. That's a great way to describe it. And I have a lot of affection for the first I think it's like 40, let's say like 50 issues of the original printed series, which was the independent publishing company that Peter Laird and Kevin Eastman made. just called Mirage. Mirage Studios made the initial, run of these Ninja Turtle cartoons, but it was happening almost like in the shadows while Turtle, it was like Turtle Mania. That's what people used to say. The toys were difficult to get sometimes. I think there were newsworthy incidents of people fighting over the release of the Ninja Turtle toys when they would come out. Simultaneous to all of that development, this comic book series was continuing, and it was supposed to be for adults. And it's hard for me to know how they were consumed and how they were thought of during that time because I was too young to know about it. I started collecting these as kind of like, when I got a little bit older, it's like, oh, I want to find the adult version of the Ninja Turtle. So I would go and seek these things out. And what I found was, Peter Laird and Kevin Eastman they just kind of threw up their hands and they're just like, all right, we've got a huge hit. And so we're just going to kind of manage this phenomenon. And we're going to leave it up to other writers and artists to take on the Ninja Turtle story. And that's what happens. So if you try and find any of these issues, you'll find a huge range of approaches and like you say, styles, and also like themes and atmospheres. Like there are a couple issues of the Ninja Turtles that the atmosphere is kind of like Back to the Future or something like that. There are a couple of them where it's supposed to be like a really bloody manga, like a Japanese comic, and there are other ones that are like Dawson's Creek or something, where there's no action at all. And some of these elements made it into the first movie. If you watch the first movie, there's this weird little middle section where there's these little montages where the turtles are crying and they're just kind of sitting around. They're depressed and yeah, they have real turtle tears on their turtle faces. It's ridiculous. Like the movie itself is ridiculous.
There's a recurring bit that's come up in the last year or two on Saturday Night Live where they'll have these little animated segments of middle-aged mutant Ninja Turtles. Have you seen these?
No, I shouldn't see that.
Yeah, but it's it's fairly funny partly because it's like one of the Ninja Turtles has testicular cancer, and like then one of the Ninja Turtles has like a bad divorce, and like his daughter won't speak to him anymore. Like he's like overweight, or it's ennui and boredom and sort of ordinary grown-up problems projected onto this absolutely ridiculous, absurd premise. But it seems like that's almost like that was actually already baked into some of the original. It sounds like that's almost not a spoof. They were already doing that to themselves.
It's true, and that's also what I feel like is happening with Batman. I was talking about it with a friend of mine yesterday, actually, and he was saying it's almost as if we need some of the things of our past to play a role in all areas of our lives. Batman can't just be sort of a mythological superhero. He also has to kind of represent like the fight against terrorism.
There's a at this point pretty hackneyed argument that we should treat superhero movies or superhero stories sort of as a pure vehicle for all of our most serious ideas and myths, because they are the equivalent to the Greek myths or the Norse myths. And then I think, as plenty of other people have pointed out, one of the big differences between comic book heroes and Greek myths is that comic book heroes are copyrighted. Like somebody does own them. It's not one individual artist who has a vision, though sometimes that a certain incarnation will be turned over to the vision of an individual artist, but it is a company's property. And you sent me a really wild and fascinating review by Armand White of the Christopher Nolan 2008 movie, The Dark Knight.
Oh yeah.
And I rewatched it, both that and the original Tim Burton Batman, which he much preferred. Mm-hmm. But I'd forgotten about this sequence in the Nolan movie right at the beginning where he beats the shit out of and like locks up a bunch of off-brand Batmans. They're who are, I mean, in one point he bends the barrel of a gun, like Batman doesn't use guns, but that's really more of a style question because he uses plenty of like incredibly deadly weapons. So it's like they're fucking up his brand, or they're violating trademark, and when one of them says, well, we're just trying to help you. You're a symbol. It's like they're almost making the Greek myth argument. And his response is, well, why can't we join you? His response is, well, I don't wear hockey pads. Like, I have a better budget than you do. I have better production.
Does.
Right. And he does. And so there's something like, there is something like almost uncomfortably corporate about it from the guy.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But all right. So let's talk we'll start with the Armand White and we can spin out from there.
Sure. So I don't have to give a description of what Batman is, right?
I don't know. I don't think so. Yeah. It's a very, very old DC comics property and it's been
1939.
1939. Okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So predated by Superman, but still quite old. And there was a very, very popular children's live action show starring Adam West that is it is extremely silly, and there's nothing menacing or sinister about it. It's just a very goofy self-aware. I mean, it has to be self-aware. So it's been I haven't seen it since I was a kid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely self-aware. And I've been reading the past couple of days as if I've been preparing for a class today. But I was reminded of the Comics Code. Are you familiar with the Comics Code?
Is this like the Hays Code, but for comics?
Exactly. Yeah. And it came out. There was an author. Gee, I had it up here on my other computer. It was a book called Seduction of the Innocent, and it was sort of focused on the kind of the erotic or maybe like sort of hidden eroticism of comics and the violence. And it sort of led to this campaign that eventually resulted in a nationwide comics code that really restricted I guess the creativity of comics creators, but it lasted for a while, and it also just really restricted the economy of selling comics. And this guy's name was Frederick Wertham, and he also, there's a section in the book apparently where he talks about the sort of the hidden homosexual agenda of Batman and his relationship with the boy wonder Robin.
Right. Which has been much spoofed and discussed, and like plenty of people have pointed out the maybe parallels to the like rich older single gentleman and the young male companion.
Sure.
There does seem to be like a real maybe one of the questions with comics that this guy seems to have had no sense of humor about is that there does seem to be a real difference between what you're hinting at or playing with and what you're and what you're instructing people in, right? Like I think you could have shades of innuendo without having an agenda. For sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the benefits of having both a visual and a written narrative together. That's why comics and films sometimes work in similar ways and have a few different things going on at the same time.
Yeah, so you sent me a progression of specifically of Batmobiles, which are I want to see if we can just make these three images available because it is pretty striking.
I think it tells the story better than I could.
Oh man, yeah, the just sort of souped up, goofy sports car of the Adam West version, the big, long, truly still like extremely phallic and also just really cool looking, as you said, art deco joke. I mean, it's sort of a joke, but the Tim Burton Batmobile it's just an awesome piece of design.
Yeah,
and then
all of the Tim Burton is art deco, which is probably why I'm drawn to it. I'm just sort of a deco fan.
And then the Christopher Nolan Batmobile, which is. It's really not a Batmobile. It's just this big, joyless, stylus tank. That's just this, military industrial machine.
Yeah.
There's no. Like, You could see both Adam West and Michael Keaton picking up ladies or gentlemen in those Batmobiles.
Yeah.
The Christopher Nolan one is this is for like crushing villagers. I mean, this is
nation destroying, nation invading.
No, exactly. So there was this progression from the Adam West version, which we're calling it the Adam West version. He was the star of it, but it was very goofy, and they even had, I think, one of their devices they became much mocked for and celebrated, I guess, was having little cartoon jagged I don't know, speech balloons of
word bubble speech balloons,
onomatopoeic speech balloons, whap, bam, whap, pow, that would appear on screen in the midst of the very hokey stagey fights,
with surf rock music in the background generally.
Right. And which I watched as a kid. They were reruns by then, but I watched them as a kid, and they were fun, silly. I mean, we were effectively live action cartoons.
Yes.
And then Tim Burton in 1989 came out with this other vision, which I think at the time, I was 7 when it came out, and it was basically, it just blew my mind. Like, it was the coolest thing I could imagine at that age when I saw it in the theater. And it was, rewatching it now, it is much more silly and goofy and more aware of itself than I was, at that age. But it's extremely stylish. It is funny. And I'd say it is not, it has just enough seriousness to be basically, like, not to be boring if you're a grown-up watching it with your kid. But it's not, there's never any like deep dread. It doesn't ever really ask any like profound moral questions. It's mostly just like an exercise in style. And you pointed earlier, we're not going to get into it really in this conversation, but you pointed earlier to the Susan Sontag article, Notes on Camp, which is a terrific read. I'm definitely going to link to it. It's definitely worth reading. But it is, if she says it's impossible to be self-aware, to be self-consciously campy. But if you could be that would be the Tim Burton version.
For sure.
It's just like a delicious, fun, silly, exciting movie that doesn't pretend to be anything more than what it is for the most part.
Yeah, it basically it sort of in a healthy way digested all, because already there were so many kinds of Batman styles and incarnations by the time Tim Burton's film came around. I think even before the TV show, it had jumped back and forth a little bit between being kind of gritty and being focused on the vigilante aspect of Batman, sort of being outside the law. I was reading that there were early issues where he would use guns. He shot and killed villains. But eventually, as it became more popular, there were just more decisions to sort of to make him more of a citizen and concerned with citizens and concerned with Gotham. I think Batman's pretty interesting when he seems to think that in a way he sort of embodies Gotham. But it also it does not leave. I mean, Adam West and that TV show, I think, is core to Tim Burton's Batman, and that's what I really appreciate about it, I think.
And it is funny because he does his little batarangs and grappling hooks and things. So he has all these tools that are not quite guns, but sort of gun-like in some respects. But he exercise, he uses these all throughout much of the movie. But as it approaches its climax, he murders tons of people in that movie. He blows up a factory full of people. He throws a guy down a bell tower. But part of what I think allows it to stay light is that it's never really serious. Almost everything is still sort of a joke and sort of it's still a little bit bam pow whap, even though it just takes a slightly more grown up amplification in excitement. But there's not a. It was interesting seeing the Burton and the Nolan back to back, because in the Burton he wipes out a ton of criminals and he does this Joker, I'm going to kill you, and he does kill him. But there is a sense that the Joker is super evil, but in a totally silly sort of arbitrary way, and Batman is good in that he's fighting against him. But there's no real deep question of morality. Batman doesn't have a code in any sense other than having kind of a sense of style. And he's not even necessarily like a deeply moral person. He's sort of like a slightly out to lunch rich guy who like sort of accidentally sleeps with a reporter. And I mean, he's sort of a little bit like he's a kind of in some ways like a classic Michael Keaton, like charmingly nerdy, absent-minded, bumbling character who also beats people up at night in a costume.
I think it's illustrated wonderfully in some of the earliest moments of the film where Bruce Wayne is depicted sort of in his element. He's throwing a party. I can't remember what the party was for, some sort of fundraising event maybe. But he spots Kim Basinger, who's the journalist that he sort of has his eye on, and he's sort of following her around his mansion. And his live-in servant, Alfred, is following him around, making sure everything is sort of okay at the party. And Michael Keaton, who's just amazing as this character, he has, I think, a drink and a plate of food in his hand. And he's so fixated on Kim Basinger, he's sort of following her around. And without thinking about it, he's just trying to put his drink down, and he sort of puts it on the edge of a pool table. It immediately starts to slip off. Alfred rushes in, picks it up real quick. And then he puts the plate of food just on the edge of the table. He doesn't know what he's doing with it. And then that starts to fall off. Alfred, he's not aware of his surroundings. And I think the movie, and I think other maybe TV shows and comic books, make a point of shining a light on how Batman is kind of a stunted. His maturity is stunted. Probably because his parents were killed when he was a kid, and he has this kind of child's idea of how to spend money, and just the very fact that he decides to become a superhero in order to honor his dead parents I feel like the show, maybe it's just my imagination, but I really feel like there are some incarnations of the Batman franchise where it's aware of the fact that Batman is sort of childish, that he is kind of ridiculous, and that he is putting himself out there in a silly way instead of doing what he should have done, which is grieve.
Right. Yeah. His parents are killed in front of him, and it's depicted a million different times, a million different ways. But basically,
right.
they're shot coming out of a movie for no reason, or for their wallets or whatever. And then he does have a kind of, as other people have pointed out, he does have an obsession with street level crime. That for the most, like, there are some super villains, but mostly like Batman likes to beat up on poor street criminals. He's not. He seldom does he really bust white collar crime. The Nolan version picks up on some of those themes, but in a way that is, I developed a little bit of a theory of it, but we can talk some about it. So Christopher Nolan in 2004, I think, put out a movie called Batman Begins, which was a kind of a new origin story of Batman, way more intense and serious and grim than the Tim Burton. And I will say that I quite like Christian Bale as an actor. Boy, he has no fun in these movies. There's not a lick of genuine. I mean, Tim Burton and definitely Jack Nicholson just eat up every scene they're in. They're just having a blast, and there's a lot of bodybuilding and no fun for Christian Bale. But then the Dark Knight was the standout of the three movies that Christopher Nolan put out. In 2008, the two villains of this version were Harvey Dent, and then most memorably the Joker, played by Heath Ledger in his last performance on film. So Armand White, this was critically beloved. It was a huge hit. It was a popular by just about every metric you could identify. And Armand White, who is a career-long contrarian, put out an absolute. I hesitate to call it a hatchet job because it's not like it hurt the movie, but it is the most severe thumbs down of a movie review I may ever have read, especially for an extremely popular and beloved movie. Armand White, by the way, fascinating, strange guy. He has to be the only writer who has ever been on the staff of both Out Magazine and the National Review.
Yeah, that's absolutely. That's necessary knowledge when you're going into a review by Armand White. It's almost impossible.
He loves to champion movies that critics despised. He's like a big booster of the worst of Adam Sandler's movies. And then he loves shitting on really popular movies. Yeah. Which again, it's sort of like Batman. Like I don't know if Armand White is a force for good, but I want to live in a world where he exists.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I was trying to pull a couple decent quotes from his review. He says, "The Dark Knight is not an adventure movie with a driven protagonist. It's a goddamn psychodrama in which Batman/Bruce Wayne's neuroses compete with two alter egos, Gotham City's law and order district attorney Harvey Dent and master criminal the Joker, all three personifying the contemporary distrust of virtue." He has a sort of a slightly muddled thesis about how the presence of nihilistic violence in this movie is an argument for nihilism and emptiness. And he kind of says it's all sort of teenage hip pseudo existentialism. I'll say he gives the game away a little bit by having just about nothing good to say about it. Like he's like, and the Joker's too mean, and Heath Ledger's not really a good actor, and Maggie Gyllenhaal has bad posture. You're like, right. All right, just slow down. Like there's some virtues as well.
He equates it with "There Will Be Blood," the sort of joylessness.
Oh, there will be blood, right? Yeah. And the two antagonists, the no hero.
Yeah, I would say for the most part, I feel pretty animated by this review because I think Armand White is in agreement with my love of Burton, and I think he does he manages to slip in what Burton achieved. And he says, remember how Tim Burton's 1989 interpretation of the comic superhero wasn't quite good enough? Yet Burton attempted something dazzling, a balance of scary satirical mood, which he nearly perfected in the 1992 Batman Returns. I think I agree with that. That gave substance to a pop culture totem, enhancing it without sacrificing its delight. Burton didn't need to repeat the tongue-in-cheek 1960s TV series, being romantically in touch with Catwoman, Bruce Wayne, and the Penguin's loneliness was richer. I think he's turned off by what appears like nihilism in The Dark Knight. And I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I think that same sort of sensibility that he's feeling, I feel like I see that in a lot of films, specifically action adventure, sci-fi films. He mentions post 9/11. Maybe it is a post 9/11 phenomenon. This kind of everything is fucked sort of. I don't know. It's almost like it's the air that a lot of characters breathe in these films and in these reboots of ridiculous costumed superheroes. And I remember going to see it. I was enthusiastic like everyone else to see Heath Ledger's performance. I don't remember being wowed by Batman Begins, but I went to a very packed theater to see The Dark Knight, and I remember being pretty entertained and just kind of the tone of it is almost sort of was sort of a shocking quality to me. It's just like, wow, they definitely went dark. But as I've had some time to just get older and think a little bit more about this, I do find myself agreeing with him. But I guess maybe I think he goes so far. I think maybe he goes a little too far in saying that Batman needs to have morals. I'm not so sure I would make that claim. I don't really think that Batman needs to do anything. And in fact, I think like I said to you before we started today, I even think that Batman can be a Christopher Nolan type Batman. I guess the thing that sort of bums me out about Nolan's Batman is that so many movies feel like they're trying to have that kind of Nolan atmosphere. And it's been a long time now, and I don't see any end to it. There's a new Batman movie coming out. I think it was delayed because of the pandemic, with Robert Pattinson. Angela and I watched the trailer to that, and that seems even grimmer. It seems even gloomier. There's not going to be any dance sequences in this new Batman movie. I mean, like maybe I'll be eating my words when I see this. But, I like Robert Pattinson too.
So I had a theater director years ago told me that the first and maybe most important job of any actor is to create interest, and I think that sort of can go for almost any kind of artist, and that to me is like that's almost the whole story of the Tim Burton Batman, start to finish. And it's definitely, that's the thing, is like Armand White shits on Heath Ledger, which is a fine contrarian take. But like the thing about Heath Ledger's performance is that it's just fun to watch. It's just, it creates interest. you can argue that it's inconsistent. You can argue that I'll say his performance is way better than the dialogue he delivers. It's just totally scenery chewing, fun to watch performance. Not so much Christian Bale's, but I think my feeling watching it again was not necessarily that I wanted Batman to have a certain set of morals. I don't think Tim Burton's Batman really has a very consistent set of morals.
No,
he's just fun to watch. The thing that I found increasingly bothering me about the Nolan Batman is actually that Batman has excessively consistent morals. That's the thing. Is like Armin White points out that the violence is really big and intense and loud and thunderous, but it's never really realistic. That's partly an artifact of the rating, because it's PG-13. It can't quite have gore, which means you can have just enough violence to really give people a sense that a lot of people are getting killed, but never really make it feel uncomfortably real. So in a way, it's the worst of both worlds, because it's very easy to just knock people off without feeling bad about it. But
what does it mean that in 1989, Jack Nicholson's Joker is using kind of like Wile E. Coyote type tools and stuff to kill people, but the violence is very, I don't know if it's realistic, but it's memorable, it's gory, and it's a 1989 version of PG-13. I think is a little bit more violent than our modern PG-13.
Well, and it's violent by being suggestive. So there, like you don't see the newscaster die of a seizure, but you do see her like contorted, grinning rictus of a face afterward, and just like that, the specific physical quality there. And they make a whole point of how it's in the cosmetics. And then he like uses a hand buzzer to fry a guy to just like really it's a cartoonish death, but then like the blackened smoldering skeleton afterward is sort of horrifying. So it is you're right. I think in a way he gets around the rating by suggestion. I mean, there's also like a lot more pretty adult sexual suggestion in the Tim Burton version, in a way that in Christopher Nolan's it's almost like it's almost puritanical, that's purity of it. Well, and I think, and it's not even like Batman needs to make sure that people don't die. Tons of people die. Tons of civilians die. Yeah. But in the Christopher Nolan version, it's really important that Batman maintain his own moral code. That they turn this kind of like this question of using grappling hooks and batarangs rather than bullets into this profound and a totally consistent moral code where he will never kill anybody. And that's what the Joker really, really wants to get him to do. Tons of people die, but he maintains his purity in this way that it feels, in a way, like that's more disturbing than if you were just trying to, throw the Joker off of a bell tower. And the thing that I found myself thinking in the Nolan version is that it is almost as if Jeff Bezos made a movie, it might be the Christopher Nolan Batman Dark Knight movie, because in a way it's like, well, the super, super rich guy who seems to because he has all these performances where he seems to be completely out to lunch. His public persona is very scrupulously one of a rich prick who doesn't give a shit about anybody else. He's surveilling everybody. He's tapped everybody's cell phones. He operates independent of the law. He doesn't respect the jurisdiction of like police districts or even of countries. He kidnaps a guy out of China arbitrarily because he feels like it. He does absolutely whatever he wants. It has like hand in glove with the military, but secretly underneath it all, even if you think he's evil, and then in a way, like that's the moral of the story for me, is like at the end, the dumb public thinks that Batman is evil, but really we know deep down underneath it all, he's really, really pure of heart. And to me, like in a way, it's almost this like propaganda piece for like big corporations and like Homeland Security. Like, well, I know you think it's evil, but secretly, if you knew at the heart of heart, we're really the good guys and you can trust us. Just shut up and eat your oatmeal.
I think your words remind me a lot of David Graeber. Are you familiar with?
No.
David Graeber, he died last year. He was an anarchist, American writer and teacher living in England, and he wrote a book called Debt. And he sort of wrote a book kind of like picking apart an economist's like understanding of human history. And he also wrote a book called Bullshit Jobs about kind of like modern middle management, corporate level work and the labor involved, or the lack of labor involved, the lack of meaning and involvement. And then I think one of his last books was just a collection of his essays, mostly around bureaucracy. But he had this really just lovely piece about Batman, and specifically about Nolan's Batman. He says that Nolan's Batman takes a lot, takes quite a bit from the vast history of Batman, but he focuses on the policeman within Batman, or the status quo keeping element of Batman. And Batman is essentially anti-creative. He needs things to stay the same, and that the creative forces in the world of Batman are all the villains that he comes into contact with. In fact, I think there's even like shades of Occupy Wall Street in the third Nolan movie.
The third one is like almost like an anti Bernie Sanders movie. Like it's weirdly anti-socialist in this bizarre way.
Do you know that whole dark reality of one of the bridges, that it was a heavy police presence to keep the Occupy protesters out, but then it was like months later that bridge was allowed to be used to depict scenes in the Dark Knight Rises.
Oh man!
This, of course, was described in David Graeber's essay about Batman, and I haven't gotten to it yet myself, but I've been meaning to rewatch at least some of the Batman animated series from the 1990s, which was another big I don't know if you watched that.
Yes, I did see some of that as a kid. Yeah. Which was like stylish. It was like
it
a
was
fun,
stylish.
Yeah.
Definitely takes its aesthetics from Tim Burton's Deco, sort of like basically the 1920s and 30s plus computers. You know, it has this odd sort of no time where it lives, you know. And there are several episodes where I feel like, just like Batman Returns with Danny DeVito's Penguin, the narrative is completely focused on the villain, to the point where inevitably at the end, where the villain is either intentionally or usually unintentionally killed by Batman. Batman might like try to save the villain at the end, but some sort of disaster happens and the villain dies, and you get so sort of involved and attached to these villains and their backstories, which are usually, you know, they're usually bottom up as opposed to Batman's top down origin story, that you're heartbroken at the end of it. And seeing that was one of my early theater moments, is going to see Batman Returns with Danny DeVito. And most of that, I don't know if Michael Keaton has more running time than Danny DeVito as the Penguin. You see a lot of the Penguin. I think it begins with him as a child and his parents trying to, I don't know, just like do away with him because he was a little freak. And his tragic death just like, it did something to me as a kid when I saw that. I was not happy when Batman was able to kill all the villains at the end. I think Catwoman makes her way out of it. I was pretty torn up.
Yeah, which and so there is and I mentioned before, the leftist nerd podcast struggle session. They have done a couple of episodes on the contrast they tend to talk most about is between the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies and the Zack Snyder DC movies, or the Zack Snyder solar system of DC movies, which are dark and gloomy in a particular way. Their argument, which I don't know if I buy it entirely, but I think their argument is that basically all superhero movies are intrinsically fascistic. Like what you're saying is that what we really need to solve our problems is an all-powerful strongman to whom we are, mere mice, and that we just need to make sure we facilitate him and don't get in his way while he saves the day. I mean, Superman being like a literally a Nietzschean figure, and so their argument is actually that it is better to let that be overt, to let the darkness and the cruelty and the fascism of it be on the face of it, so that you just accept when you walk into the theater that you're watching an entertainment. You're not going to actually say, I want to be like this, or I want this to exist. You're just saying, like, I know I'm watching cartoon characters smash each other. Whereas with the Marvel movies, I think their argument is that it sort of tries to cajole you in with cool banter into thinking like, we're like the good guys. It's fine. You can trust us. I'm Iron Man, who your friend Iron Man. So I mean, it's worth listening to some of their arguments about it. But it does seem like, I think like that's where I do quite disagree. I think with Armand White, in that I'm in a way I'm skeptical of morality taught through superhero stories. But you have a much longer back and deep and like richer background with superhero stories and comics. So what do you think about the moral, psychological, cultural role of figures like this? Like, is there something they should do other than just be cool and entertain? Is there how else should they complicate our sense of our own actual selves in any way?
I think like you said before, they're superhero stories they're pretty dirty to begin with because they're products. I think that there is magic to be witnessed in the fact that there are so many creative voices involved in all these stories, and they can take them in so many different directions. And it's fascinating to watch how they shift. They ultimately are products, and I think it can be pretty obnoxious to see just the clip between reboots is getting shorter and shorter anymore. That you can barely catch your breath before a new reboot comes out. And so just the obvious like cash grab nature of reprinting superhero films is disturbing. That's a pretty interesting take from the struggle session. I've listened to, I think, their takes on like video games, which I've enjoyed, but I haven't heard them talk about Zack Snyder. And honestly, I haven't seen a lot of the Zack Snyder stuff, but I do know about how he's more upfront and the Marvel. Like I've heard like the Marvel. I try to stay away from the Marvel Cinematic Universe stuff, but I know that the costumes are they've got a little bit of a military chic going on. But yeah, I mean that whole like I think both DC and Marvel producers will be the first to say that like these are our modern myths, and I think that's going a little too far. They're not, they don't
because we can't tell our version of them. We can't adopt them and change them, right?
Yeah, precisely. I mean, like we can to a certain extent, but not really. You could do your own slash fiction,
right? Yeah, this is true. Yeah,
I think in the David Graeber piece, he also talks about just the fact that comic books at a certain point became, there was a time before Detective Comics, before they were influenced by like Mask of Zorro and other like radio dramas and stuff like that. It became much more focused on teenage boys or even younger than that, just maybe prepubescent boys. It became the focus of the whole comic book universe, and in some ways, the more modern phenomenon of like graphic novels is a way to try to like go back to the earlier pluralist landscape of comics, that it could really be anything within reason. But comics were used to just tell stories, any story really. But there became a point in I guess the 1940s, something like that, 1930s, 1940s, where there were these sort of fantastical characters, much like the struggle sessions description of like perhaps maybe a fascist, all-powerful being, Superman being the clear archetype there. And then when people hear that I do comics, I think that's what they hear, and that's what they see in their mind still to this day. They're seeing, okay, you're doing like, okay, you like what do you like, Marvel? You like DC? You like Image? What do you? I was pretty snooty about it through my 20s. I was like, well, I don't read any comics that have superheroes anymore. I'm an adult, and I find myself like going back to superheroes now, I guess just because I like this tension that we're describing now. I like the fact that it's inherently like kind of a dirty thing. It's supposed to, it has its birthplace in being only for boys or something. And it's and only for young boys. Even if it was unconscious at the time, it was supposed to make them patriotic, or maybe it was supposed to make them sort of like self-making or something.
Public perception of comics has changed a lot since like I was a teenager, and they've become more and more considered an art form that can do a lot of different things. I wonder, is there something either intrinsic to the medium or to the tradition that allows for a certain level, like a certain detachment from reality, or a certain super real quality that whether you're dealing with superheroes or not, and whether it's explicitly campy or not, it allows for a different kind of storytelling. Like people have said that there's in a certain sense the novel is the most, there is a realism that is achievable in a novel that's not achievable in any other medium because you inhabit it with your mind, and you can inhabit the character's mind, and with your own, and obviously different media have different strengths. Now that comics are no longer considered like trash art, what is the what do you see as being like a defining quality of them formally or by the way of the tradition?
Yeah. I mean, the possibilities are are limitless with comics, because just the drawing style, I think, just sort of changes everything. And I think it's really hard to know how comics live in the audience's mind, because there's so many things going on at the same time. Maybe the most popular comics and maybe some, like, people that don't read comics regularly, they might come across some well-known comics even into their adult life. Comics that they think like, well, this is a sophisticated graphic novel. I could read this. This is not for a child. This is for me. I think they tend to be all generally the same format, which is very cinematic, almost working like a glorified storyboard, and that's totally acceptable to me. That's a style of comic, but it's just like that's not the only way that you need to make a film. There's so many different ways you can sort of work your comic. The most memorable comics I've read are not quite cinematic. They sort of steer you around. They steer your eye around the page. They decorate the frames. They do things to the word bubbles. The design of the word bubbles are not just a secondary thing. They become sort of part of the artwork, and they sort of do things to the cadence of the page, and you start to hear what's going on a little bit. I could give the listener a few examples. When I was a kid reading comics, my favorite comic was a comic called The Max by Sam Keith. So a lot of people might know the MTV cartoon, The Max. And, I don't know if I like it as much as I did when I was a kid, but I still feel that sort of like intense teenage nostalgia when I read The Max now. I'm actually going back through it these days. Sam Keith kind of blew my mind because he changed he changed the actual mediums he was using from page to page. He would sometimes use oil paint and collage on certain pages. He would sometimes just use it would look like a Charles Schultz, like a lot of little panels, and he would kind of purposefully draw quickly and have sort of a naive look to the pages. So I think just what's possible with the visuals and with how you are representing communication. You don't have to use words. There's a lot of like brilliant wordless comics out there, but just the possibilities of that are just kind of like, well, it's overwhelming. And I think that's what stops up a lot of independent cartoonists when they sit down to it. I think much like we were talking about, like with just ownership at the beginning of this conversation, I think we tend to give the highest respect to people that do everything alone, where
Right.
they write and draw everything, they edit everything. It's an enormous amount of labor. And I can tell you, like, any chance I get to have some assistance with my comics, I'll take it. Because I've been working, I'm finishing up a 20-page comic. It's only 20 pages. It'll take you just a bathroom break to go through this comic that I'm working on now. But I wrote it years ago, and just the process of editing the script I had, having people take a look at the script, which was very helpful for me, kind of designing the characters, looking at Google Maps, Street View, deciding where I want to place this. You don't have to go through this amount of labor, but you can really get caught up in the details of it. And I'm not so sure that it needs to be a single artist working on this. I think it just because of the complexity of it, it can be much like a film where there's a lot of hands and there's a lot of eyes on it, and it doesn't necessarily have to be like one genius's concept.
I think the part of the beauty of film is that it is as Aristotle said, of the epic, which combines the lyric and the dramatic with the narrative. The film combines all of these different art forms into acting and writing and physical design and costuming and all these different forms, as with theater, get combined into one with the added element of film. But I think particularly as the medium has developed, the reality of it is that what that means is that the real obstacle to making it is money.
Oh yeah.
Like you have to have a shit ton of money to make a movie, and it seems like whether you translate it into money or into time, with a comic, as you said, like it's an enormous amount of work, and there's not really an essential reason that one person needs to do all of it, except maybe that if it's not one person doing it, if it's a big team of people doing it, then somebody's paying for all of that.
Yeah.
And so then it belongs to someone with the money to pay all of those people. So it's like it either ends up being a lone wolf kind of laboring for hours and years, or it's this big team.
Yeah.
I had not thought about the spacing and the presentation of the
layout
and specifically of the words. I mean, of the dialogue. And I've read some comic books of various types, less of the classic superhero stuff than nerdy, pretentious comics. But I do. I mean, there are a lot of, as you said, there are a lot of sort of interesting tricks you can use with the contrast between, say, the presentation of the dialogue and the presentation of the speech balloon itself, as well as where it falls on the page. And that is the devices that are used in presenting speech, particularly in a comic book, are, I would say, actually pretty similar specifically to free verse poetry. And that like the way line breaks tend to get used in free verse poetry for the most part is the way they're used to break up speech in a way that reveals psychology, either because you're splitting open a potential double meaning, or because you're, as Nicholas and Baker said, you're slowing things down so that it takes us a minute to get to the next step of the dialogue. But that is, I think there is similarity there, and it may be that as you know, with you said that comics are clearly bear some resemblance to storyboards for movies, and it may be that you're doing something similar with image, where you're breaking it down, or you're slowing it down or speeding it up and giving us these little moments to focus on. Part of what makes for a really good pairing of dialogue or narration with image is that you know what to leave out. You know how much space to leave between those two, so that they're not perfectly redundant, but they're also not totally disjointed.
Absolutely. I think it's rare that I've seen illustrators take advantage of the word bubble and the type and the font, but I've seen it a little bit, and it's definitely had an impact on me. The most brilliant, or maybe the most brilliant / also the most show-offy version I've seen is the comic, the middle and later issues of the comic series Cerebus, not Cerberus, but Cerebus, by Dave Sim. And I'll have a warning here, if this makes it into the podcast, that is made by a pretty vile misogynist person who I'm sort of wondering if he'll ever be adopted by the alt-right of modern day, because he sort of followed his divorce by creating this sort of like army of super violent feminists in his comics, which was also a comic about an aardvark. It's this gladiator aardvark character. So talk about taking a silly idea and not only bringing it into reality, but bringing your own sort of reactionary fears into the comic. It's a fascinating psychological study of an artist like losing his mind, but he goes after those word bubbles and those letters in a way I've never seen before. I mean, it's incredible. Sometimes it's probably too much, because he's very pleased that he can do this trick. If I were teaching comics to teenagers, which I do sometimes, I make sure that they see at least a page of Cerebus.
What's the Blake line? You never know what is enough until you know what is more than enough.
Yeah.
It seems I hadn't thought about it, but there is something to the the appeal of ultra serious superhero movies now, and we talked a little bit in emails about the sense sometimes in some of these super serious movies of almost embarrassment at the subject matter.
Yeah, yeah. And I was telling you, it was from when you said that, it instantly reminded me of my upbringing, which is a very Protestant upbringing. And I wondered what you thought about like my sort of parallel of that.
Well, and so how did I was also raised very religiously. I was Catholic, but there was plenty of embarrassment and shame and humiliation growing up. But I'm curious sort of how did you specifically see? Yeah, how exactly did embarrassment play in for you?
Well, first I should say that like, yeah, I think there is a sort of unconscious embarrassment in like a Christopher Nolan or in these movies, but the fact that they're dealing with sort of like material that's supposed to be for children, and they're in a way they're trying to like mature it in the length of the movie. They're trying to completely bring it into the adult world and also give it some kind of sophistication, some kind of like artistry that, I don't know, just like turns them into serious filmmakers, I suppose. And I don't know, yeah, that instantly reminded me of the way I saw my inherited faith expressed. I was talking with someone a couple of days ago, and he talked about how he went to youth group in high school, and his pastor had some sort of like really complicated mathematical equation for like how things predicted in the Bible have come true. And so there's you're burying your head in your hands.
Yeah.
There's so there's not even faith involved. It's just actually it's just, what's the economic term? It's like a
proof or a
yeah for sure. And I just, when you said that, I had never thought about that before. But and this is still kind of like a fresh thought for me. But I wonder if that was involved in the kind of anxious sort of stranglehold on Christianity that I saw in the churches that I was raised in. Yeah, people always say Protestants are super literal, and I think they're only literal about certain things, the things that sort of work for the way that they approach the status quo and the way they approach power and stuff like that. But they are indeed literal about, they think they're literal. So I think that's enough. You know, if you zoom out from that, they're dealing with something that can't be seen, that can't be proven, something that is ancient and strange. They're dealing with these weird, old ancient stories. Perhaps there's an embarrassment to that. And so you have to surround it with a lot of hellfire and I guess also mathematical equations in order to make you feel sort of grown up about it.
Yeah, I don't know if you ever saw the movie, or this, maybe you didn't need to see a movie, maybe this is more of your own experience, but if you ever saw the documentary Hell House.
Oh no, I haven't. No.
Oh, you would. It's worth seeing. It's actually. I mean, it is more moving than one might expect. But it follows this tradition in this small town. Very. Oh,
I think I know what you're
Christian.
Say.
Yeah, they're very Christian, very devout, and they're some kind of fundamentalist evangelical Christian. But they have a fundraiser they do every year, which is an elaborate haunted house informed by Christian virtues, but it is genuinely, big boy pants terrifying, like big, horrible, bloody, demons, but it's about, being gay or having abortions or masturbating. Like the horror is full scale grown up style.
Sure.
So yeah. It's a good documentary, but it does, I think you're right about that. I think about if you read some of the like old commentary or mockery of Darwin or arguments about Darwinism. I think today, like during the Bush administration, when I think it was like when Richard Dawkins is publishing The God Delusion, we were kind of at the height of like acrimonious debate over evolution in school textbooks and atheism and religion, all this stuff. I think the debate was that the offense that evolution had committed was that it seemed to replace God. But I think if you go back closer to when it first came out, people were really deeply scandalized by the suggestion that we descended from apes.
Sure, yeah.
Like there was something like anatomically humiliating about being told that you descended from apes. And I think that we are increasingly absurd, laughable creatures in the universe. And yet I think it becomes harder for us to bear laughable, cartoonish depictions of ourselves. Like we want even our cartoons to be grown up and serious. In a way, like there is something as dumb and like you can't redeem the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles into James Bond. Like you can't make them cool and sexy. There does seem to be some new version of it where they're like really gross and scary looking.
I haven't seen it. Yeah.
Well, I've just seen the still that you sent me is all I see.
Yeah.
but there doesn't like with an aardvark being your hero, or some of these old like comic premises, you can't dignify it. You cannot but be embarrassed by it. And I think that makes us squirm a little bit, because I think it hadn't occurred to me until you were saying this, that it's partly ourselves. Like we want to be, Batman is sort of like corporate power and government power, but he's also American power, right? And I think like we don't want to seem goofy and dumb and cartoonish and vain and spoiled. We want to seem gritty and cool and grown up to ourselves.
It's true.
But we're a fucking aardvark, we're actually just a Ninja Turtle.
At the end of the day, we are an aardvark. Yeah, we are all one aardvark. Yeah, and indeed, it's called the Scopes Monkey Trial. So the monkey was, I guess it was a nightmarish image that we're monkeys. But I guess, like you said, I mean, I don't know if I'm trying to eradicate anything, and I don't. Maybe I would not have come to this obsessive fun I've been having over Batman and Ninja Turtles if it weren't for this period that we're living in, and if it weren't for Christopher Nolan. I sort of believe in these things having lives beyond the original source material. I don't believe that that Batman is in his purest form when he was in the Detective Comics in 1939. I think there's something to be said about an artwork having a life form. There's a really good writer who's a music critic named Grail Marcus, and he talks a lot about the lifespan of songs. And he's very much an anti-ownership kind of person. He loves the story of an artist and a musician creating a piece of work, but he never sees the work as finished at that point. He writes these biographies of songs, and he kind of tells stories about how they're reinterpreted and covered, and like what was going on when they were covered, what was going on in the audience when they first heard that cover, or something like that. I don't know. That's sort of inspirational for me.
And there's something about, I don't know that, for whatever historical reasons, the legal restrictions on songs are different, so that if you use the actual recording of a song, then that's very, very tightly regulated. But it's much looser if you want to cover a song. Mm-hmm. So that like that's part of why we end up having all these great, really different covers of old songs. Yeah. And in a way, like, boy, it would be great if we didn't keep revising copyright law so that Mickey Mouse remained private property.
Oh boy.
Like that is truly that defines copyright law, is like we keep extending it in order not to let Mickey Mouse be public property. But I think I would be interested in seeing what happened with some of these if suddenly the copyrights lapsed,
Yeah. If you want to have another obsessive conversation like this, I cannot stop obsessing over Walt Disney. I think he's an absolutely fascinating character, and just like the most American. If anyone was a manifestation of the United States of America, it's Walt Disney. And he's a truly tragic figure. But anyway, I'll get going off of that.
What I find myself doing with guests who come on, and I did this. I had an interview just the other day where I did this again, but I now have a project I want you to do.
Oh.
I want you to write, whether it's as a comic or what something, I want you to write the like cartoon depiction of the tragedy of Walt Disney.
Yeah.
Like I want you to like write like a personal story about him in some way.
I've tried to do pieces of it. I was very fascinated by the Union strike. I've done some political comics, and I talk a lot about like labor movements and stuff like that.
Yeah. His politics are pretty horrible, if I recall.
Yes, and he is the son of an abusive father. He was also a socialist of his time, of the early 1900s. And there's an early, Angela and I saw it when we were in San Francisco. There's a museum of Disney things. It's actually owned by the Disney family and not the Walt Disney Museum. And they had an illustration that Walt did when he was 14 years old. His dad's like socialist or labor focused newspaper that his dad was involved with. And it's this drawing of I don't know what's a drawing of, just some character, but it's a beautiful drawing. and I hadn't seen a lot of his actual drawings. But anyway, just the knowledge that he was so anti-union and pro progress at the expense of laborers. Was he acting out against his father? I don't know. It's his parents were killed in a freak accident in a house purchased by Disney. I mean, I could go on and on. It's just like a absolutely fascinating, tragic story.
I want you to write this book or something. Yeah.
I guess what I was trying to say, I've pitched this before. I've pitched this very thing to newspapers and magazines, and they're like, "Are you kidding? I don't want to get sued by Disney. They'll come after us," and they do. They play hardball against anyone that says a bad word about them. You know, that's been their. Well, they play offense.
There's a different. Well, I mean, yeah, no, that's true. Disney may be like the Scientologists, and that you just like it's not worth the trouble. I would love to read or see some version of this from you.
I probably will have to do it at some point because it's like you're experiencing now. I can't get it out of my head. So maybe this is a way that it'll help me rest. It'll help me put him to rest, as it were.
At some point, Angela will get to stop hearing about it, and that'll.
Yeah. Oh my God! Yeah. Poor Angela. Yeah.
What are you working on in one capacity or another these days?
Like a lot of people who are privileged and can do a lot of their work from home throughout the pandemic, I had more time on my hands than I knew what to do with, and so I jumped into making my first fiction comic, kind of a longer story than I have in some time. Most of my comics are nonfiction. It's interesting, we're talking about Christianity. The last thing I've had published was for the Nib, and it was about kind of a history of various political expressions within Christianity. And it's sort of based off of conversations I've had with some scholars and some Christians. And before that, I did a thing for the New Yorker about how silly it is to be teaching during the pandemic. And so like I do a lot of things about teaching, and I do a lot of things about labor, and it's usually those are just some of my interests, and I'm involved in that work a little bit, and it's just those are things I'm thinking about. But I've had a story in my kind of kicking around my mind for the last like 5 or 6 years, and I'm finally putting it into about a 20-page comic story, which is a short. It's a short story, and I've been slowly just posting on Instagram. It's called The Rites, RITES. It's about 3 siblings spreading the ashes of their recently deceased mother, and they're having to follow increasingly strange instructions, and that's all it is. And should be done with that in hopefully next month, honestly, and then I'll clean it up and see if I can get it somewhere. And then I'll be back to just my other freelance illustration lifestyle, which is painting a lot of people's pets. That's my primary.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah. This is your my specialty.
It's true. My bread and butter is I make anthropomorphic illustrations of people's dogs and cats, or any pet. Honestly, I'll draw any pet. I love doing it, and I'm hoping to grow that business a little bit more because it's been good to me. All of which was an idea by my wife, Angela Fleury. So
I know you've done animal drawings for my daughters who love them and who have since demanded that you come back and do more drawings for them at some point. Which we would love for you to do.
This was great. Angela and I have been loving SLEERICKETS, and so I came to you as a fan. First and foremost, we always try to put song lyrics to your SLEERICKETS theme, and so every time I listen, I try to add lyrics. Someday I'll come up with good lyrics.
Please, yeah. The theme song is by a producer named Eternal, ETRNL. Speaking of which, that's public domain that he made available. I found a little tiny snippet of it. Yeah, so cool. I always put his name in the show notes, but he just makes a lot of music for free out there.
Right. Also, I was going to ask you, are you ever going to print SLEERICKETS t-shirts?
Sure, if people want them. I don't, but I'm not opposed to it.
Well, you have at least one vote here. So, right. Thanks just for being down for this and for inviting someone who's very much a novice to poetry like me to your poetry heavy podcast.
I think as a novice in poetry, you're like Socrates, and like you may be the wisest man by acknowledging that you know nothing, because it's certainly full of people who think they know things.
Before you kick me off, though, I remember the last time I was in your house, I saw that you had a Robert Bly book. Do Yes, and
Yes.
you have it. Oh, you.
I have a, well, I have his translation of the selected Rilke, and then I also have
I didn't know
somewhere
that
I
he
have a copy.
translated Rilke.
It's either his translation or his. I think it's his translation. It's either that or he edited the selection somewhere. But then I also have a book he wrote called Iron John that
Sure, Iron John.
my dad gave me that I've still never read. But yeah,
Okay.
what was it that what
I
was
was just interested. I was just interested if you had any kind of relationship with him. I have a friend who is very much into him, and gave me a book of his to read. And I like to talk to anyone that has any kind of knowledge of him, because it's just a fascinating topic to me, the kind of fraught like men's movement thing that he was involved in. And I just have a lot of conflicted feelings about it. And I'm always looking for nuanced perspectives on it. And I've only heard people really hate him, or like this guy really love him.
I don't know. I have not read that much of him, and I don't know that much about it. I know of his involvement in the men's movement and Iron John, but I don't even know what that amounts to really. I'll say my biggest exposure to him was in like 2008, maybe 2007, whenever it was that AWP was in New York City. I went to AWP and saw him read to a huge room, and he had everybody in the palm of his hand. He looked like an elderly Willy Wonka. I remember he had a poem that ended with something about like some dream life, and he committed some obscure crime. And then the last line of the poem was, "And the sentence was 1,000 years of joy." And every single poem he finished, the response by the crowd was a collective, "Oh." And it's impressive because he was getting a response from the crowd, which unfortunately a lot of people don't even bother to try to do anymore. But it was it made me aware of a particular kind of response, I guess it's possible to get, that is not necessarily the one I would hope for. I think like people go to that, or they go to the same way. If you go to the arena stage in DC, the big beautiful stage theater there, they have 3 stages now. A lot of the shows they do are shows that are basically meant to flatter the very rich, very liberal audience, and because you hear a lot of the same sound, and they're being soothed by their own perceptiveness.
Yes.
So yeah, but that's about all I could say about Robert Bly. I beyond that. And he was the Black Mountain School, I think, wasn't he involved with it, or is that just Creeley?
Yeah,
I forget.
Indeed.
Maybe I'll do a Robert Bly deep dive at some point and bring you back on.
I mean, if you ever do, write to me, because I have. I mean, there are other figures that I'm familiar with, much more familiar with than Robert Bly, that are sort of attached to this, and so I was sort of unwittingly found myself like venturing into these literal woods, because these men's movement things would have happened in the woods.
And this is separate. Is this separate from the men's rights thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, and it has its own. There's a really wonderful Harper's piece about the sort of modern equivalent of Bly. I mean, Bly, was lefty, anti-Vietnam, but had this kind of back to nature, back to tribal sort of reaction to feminism that wasn't exactly an anti-feminist thing, but it was sort of like it sort of wanted to run parallel to feminism, but run backwards into what he saw as a loss of initiation in male circles, and a loss of elders, which I think is a legitimate diagnosis, but the prognosis is sort of strange, a little creepy, maybe.
Well, it may be one of those problems where the diagnosis is accurate, but there's not a good cure.
No, I don't. I don't think there is. There's this writer, a really good writer named Barrett Swanson, who went to a modern sort of like West Coast kind of men's. It's called Mankind, I think, the Mankind Project, and it was a lot of just like, we've got to make ourselves like decent citizens. We've got to make ourselves decent for women, because it's so hard for women. We've got to make ourselves decent for people of color. It's so hard for people of color, and it turned into this like sort of really odd, like rage-filled, like kind of primal scream sort of thing, similar to the 1970s psychological movements of Primal Scream. And anyway, yeah, I love that stuff. I get really into like psychological movements.
I don't know how much of this is an illusion, but like looking back through art history and literary history, there is a sense of whether or not there's initiation, there is a sense of a lineage of masters and apprentices, and the younger, Robert Lowell camps out on Alan Tate's lawn, and John Donne was the headmaster at Milton School, I think, and there is this feeling of like the junior and the senior, and I certainly have felt as in my writing life the absence of any kind of master figure. Like I've never had anything that quite was I've had some decent teachers and some people I really loved and writers I've known, but I never really had a proper master. I don't know if that's something that even has occurred to you or been something you've thought about.
I sort of stumbled into an apprenticeship. Actually, the man that I'm describing that's very, very much attracted to Robert Bly was sort of my de facto master, as it were. He was a guy that just kind of noticed my comics drawings at these like groups that I used to go to, and said like, you should draw a graphic novel. Do you know how to do it? Do you know how to use Photoshop? And I was like, no, I don't know how to do any of that. I was 22 at the time. And he was like, well, let me help you do it, and it sort of started a relationship. We're sort of friends now. I sort of see him more at eye level anymore, but I definitely looked up to him at that time. And I don't know where I'd be without his guidance. It's kind of funny to look back at him because he's such an emotional mess. He really only had a sort of aesthetics, and he had sort of a short list of things that he could kind of guide me through. But he's become a pretty good friend. He's in his 60s now, and I wonder if that's part of his attraction to it, is this guy's kind of Robert Bly's his sort of looking around the landscape and freaking out about this obvious lack in our culture. And I don't think it's. I think the whole master and apprenticeship thing comes packaged with robust community. I think the problem is not just that. It's just we're constantly deconstructing community and village life all around us. Yeah. But yeah, like I say, it seems like the ship has sailed a long time ago.
That was my conversation with Steve Teare. Again, you can follow Steve on Instagram at Steve Teare, STEVETEARE. That was our show for the week. Thank you so much for listening. You can reach me, as always, at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.